Okay, so I think if I put this here and I do that, yeah, okay, no, and I can like, yeah, okay,
Hey
okay,
Joe, what you working
okay.
on?
Oh, I'm putting together a little like homebrew project type deal. I saw this other guy do it, and I thought it was pretty cool. You want to take a look at what's going on?
Yeah. What's that red wire is connected to? What is this? You're connecting.
Oh, that don't worry about
That
it. All
looks
right,
like. Why does this say Semtex?
you shouldn't be asking those
Are you
questions. You
building
should
a
know what you should.
bomb?
No. You know what you should be doing? You should be looking at that guy. I think their name was like Timna or whatever. They're the actually scary one. They actually have like a whole like warehouse of Semtexes.
I don't know about that. We might need to let's break this down a little bit.
Are you sure? No, I'm pretty sure I'm in the right here. I'm not, guys. I'm not the threat here. Trust me. But I do know some experts that we can call on. The Man on the Rocks boys. Those guys are expert evaluators.
So threat evaluation.
Yes.
How it's time to evaluate the threats. I feel like it's a pretty like cornerstone skill of CDH. I think when you think of like the main things that you need to work on, like it's mulligans, matchups, and like threat assessment and like threat evaluation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's probably as far as like cultivatable skills and things that come into play every single game. Threat assessment is probably the single most important thing that a player can learn, can become good at outside of just being able to pilot their own deck, like knowing your lines. A threat assessment is just like, in general, being able to determine what is going on in the game and like what is currently causing the biggest issue for you and or what or who is the closest to like winning the game. Yeah, so it's like you can have a board full of like all sorts of different cards, right? You can have like Wristed Studies, a Mystic Remora, the One Ring. Somebody's got like a Winota in play. Somebody's got like Birthing Pod on the field, and like all these things are really powerful cards, right? So determining what is the most important, the most urgent thing to answer at any given point is going to, and becoming good at assessing that correctly is going to be really, really beneficial for players as they're coming up in the CEH world, right? Because if you look at a field and you say, oh, there's Aristic Study, Winota, and a Birthing Pod in play, and like the Birthing Pod player has no creatures and one card in hand. The Winota has one enabler and everyone else has blockers, and they have a few cards in hand. The Ristic Study player has been drawing like card after card after card, and it's going to them next, and they have 14 cards in hand. Like, as scary as Winota and the Birthing Pod are, it might be the Ristic Study. It's actually the biggest issue with that player because they have so many cards. Conversely, it could be something like the Birthing Pod player has it in play and no creatures, but they have 3 cards in hand and their commander's 3 cost. It's about to be their turn. That's the biggest issue, and maybe the Ristic Study player has 2 or 3 mana up, and so it's more important to feed them cards, because even though that's going to be a large issue later, at least they might be able to answer whatever the Birthing Pod player is trying to do when they combo off and try and win on their turn. So it's just like determining like what is the most pressing threat at any given.
The Ristic Study conundrum is always a tricky one to navigate because it's such a double-edged sword. Like, you need it always feels like such a risky play whenever like I personally decide to go for it, or like the table decides to go for it, because you're banking on the cards that they are drawing, that you are feeding them to be able to stop the immediate threat, and hopefully they fade enough gas that they don't just absolutely demolish the table on their turn. I think that one's really, I think that's always an interesting conundrum. But yeah, I would definitely classify it in very much the same way. Would you say like turn order like matters a lot with threat assessment then?
Definitely. I think that's a huge component, because like I was saying, if I have 14 cards in hand, but it's not going to be my turn for another 2 turns, those 14, and like I'm tapped out even, those 14 cards are realistically a non-issue until it gets to my turn. And that's something that you would have to weight against like well, does it seem like it's going to get to their turn? Do I need to be preparing for a way to answer all of these cards they're going to be untapping with once they have their mana back? Or are we in such a dire position right now that them having cards, just I need them to draw a Force of Will, so I'm going to feed them everything I possibly can, because otherwise we're losing to this, I don't know,
Whatever.
Dream Halls that's landing next turn or whatever. I don't know. So
Dream Halls.
I don't know. It's just it's in my head.
No, I think I can agree with that. I think I can agree with that. It's especially when like the Ristic Study player is tapped out. Like you literally are just banking on Force of Will. Either if you are the person trying to go for the win, and the Ristic Study player is like, can you draw? Like more often than not, like in most positions, if I'm playing and the Ristic Study player is tapped out, I'm just draw your cards, like whatever. Like I have to fade like endurances and force effects and packs. Like that's like 4 cards in your deck in total. And you probably have like 60, 70 cards in deck right now. Like the odds are in such a manner that you can like avoid that. But also conversely, that matters for when we're trying to stop someone. We're all trying to work together to stop whoever's trying to win, you know? There are so many different like powerful cards in CEDH that I feel like it's hard to manage them. I definitely have an issue with managing them and like just trying to like allocate resources when it comes to just like dealing with threats. That's why I think like cards like Bowmasters especially, where it's just it's a constant pressure in like 3 different areas and it's constant removal. That like managing those things and trying to deal with those things is difficult. I'm just talking, not really asking like questions.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, Bowmasters is a good example of a card that pushes advantage on multiple axes and punishes opponents for doing things. And so cards like that can be really strong. It's definitely worth considering the repercussions of like drawing extra cards into a Bowmasters. But at the same time, something like that isn't typically like, unless there's like a wheel on the stack, which will almost always only be cast by the person controlling the Bowmasters in that situation. Like, it's not typically something that I would consider a very high threat, unless, like, maybe you're mono green or something and you're relying on your dorks to get you through. Just because the incidental damage is, for the most part, negligible. The larger issue is, I find to be, like, when they get to have a 6/6 in their field that's literally just expendable, so they'll chuck it at anyone who they just want to deal damage to. And sometimes that's fine. Like sometimes there's an ad nauseam player who you want to like punish their life total or something, right? But once again, that it comes down to that whole idea of threat assessment, where if you're the one controlling the orcs and the bowmasters, sometimes determining who to hit isn't necessarily super obvious. Like if you're in the early game and you have a 4/4 and you know there's a Nas player, you're gonna throw the 4/4 at the Nas player because they're the person
pretty standard,
who's threatening you with their life total. So it's more adequate to answer their life total by dealing damage to them. Versus if you get to the mid game, it might not be so simple. Like maybe there is an Adnos player at the table, and so of course you think you might want to throw the 4/4 at them, but they're at like 25, 26, 27 life, so like they can Nas, and if they Nas, they will probably still win the game, but that might not be like the most pressing thing because everyone has a full grip of cards, and so counter magic exists. There might be some other stack pieces in play. So at that point, maybe you want to start pressuring the mid-range player just by either like just chipping down their life total if they're going to absorb it, or forcing them to use some of their resources on board as blockers to not take damage from your 30/30 orc or whatever. So it once again, there are a bunch of different axes and different positions that players have to make assessments from regarding who is the most threatening and what do I need to answer with this at this time. And it's like we're always saying, like things change and things flex based upon turn order and who's doing what, right? But that's just another good example of assessing threats. Sometimes it's super obvious, punch Nas player, sometimes it's not. And you're just like, you send 46 damage at the Stacks player and they're going, why? I'm locking so and so down. It's like in your hand, you're ready to pop off, but the Stacks pieces are holding you down. So your biggest threat personally is now all of the stacks on the field because it's keeping you from winning. So you just want to take them out of the game, because if you take them out of the game on your turn, you're going to win.
And one of the axes that I have always like had a personal philosophy for is like attacking the value engines and attacking the draw engines, just because they often just go so unchecked. And especially now where everyone's trying to cram as many value engines inside a given deck, that like if the board's on parity or the board's like stalling out, like yeah, I'll counter heuristic study. I'll like abrupt decay heuristic study on end step. Absolutely, I'm not gonna let you like gain advantage when we're all like kind of either like stacked out or like everyone's like not really shot their shot, but everyone's just like holding, like we're all in a standoff, right? We're all like, okay, who's gonna go first, right? And in those situations you go, well, I'm not gonna go first, but I'm gonna hold up interaction and I'm gonna develop like this Esper Sentinel or this other draw effect or like this advantage generating piece. I'm going to sneak out like this Eson or whatever. Like it's not going to win the game right now, but it will accrue me like advantage over time, right?
Yeah.
And I think those, I feel like I'm starting to see a lot more people like wake up to those kinds of things.
I think, yeah, it's definitely like one of those things, right, where you're like, I'm holding this Pyroblast, and everyone knows I'm holding the Pyroblast because I flipped it off my Dark Confidant earlier this game or whatever.
Yeah.
And someone casts a Ristic Study, and like you said, the board's on parity, and so they're trying to get a little bit ahead, just to eke out a little bit of advantage by resolving this, even though everyone has the mana to pay for it. Sometimes countering the Ristic Study, like if that lands, that's the most threatening thing because they will start to get ahead. Other times you're saying, oh, well maybe I shouldn't counter this because it does force everyone to tax their mana. As long as you can count on the table to not like be dumb, right? Which depends on the table. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It's a risk you have to wait. That said, once again, sometimes it's like you have to assess threats both seen and unseen, right? Because you're holding this Pyroblast, but everyone knows you've been holding this Pyroblast, and so player C, well, there's a Ristic Study on the stack. Player C over here is they've been sitting on
Intuition or whatever.
I was gonna say Thoracle. They're just waiting to go off, but they aren't casting it because they know you have the counter spell for their Thoracle, and so they're just waiting. And then as soon as you pop that like Ristic Study, you blow it on that, then it's like, well, now I'll just go win the game. And the Ristic Study players only got 4 cards in hand, and that's why they're trying to do it, is to sort of like get back in the game, get the cards to sort of handle other people, right? So it's things, you gotta wait archetypes, you gotta consider the game states other people are in, gotta think about turn order and all that stuff. So it's like, especially because what if that Ristic Study player has another counterspell? Are they going to like emotionally, like impulsively snap that down and counter your counter back and resolve their Ristic Study? And now you guys super lose the Oracle? Or are you preying on a top deck from the study at this point? Or are they going to be like, well, yeah, I tried to do that, but I'm also pretty sure that person over there is sitting on something, so I gotta save this, and they let their thing go. Because at that point, then it's also on them. It's like sort of like this unspoken give and take between players and figuring out where you stand in the pod. It goes back to that whole idea of like, what role are you filling in any like, generic pod composition? Are you on attack? Are you the control player? Like, what are you doing in this matchup?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like trying to just be any sort of like productive player in the game, be it like finding answers, holding answers, or like pushing the game forward. You're trying to push the game towards like obviously a win on your end. That's going to force other people to progress their own game plans to their own speed, or like react in such a way to try and stop you. The threats unseen is a tough one to really wrap your head around. And that one, I think, especially under the umbrella of threat assessment, is one of the hardest skills to like figure out, at least for me.
Yeah.
It's tough. Like I feel like I have a decent grasp on a lot of different things, right? And like how most decks like function, but even still, like it feels pretty obvious, like for example, like when the Dimir player like vampiric tutors on end step, like okay, they're likely getting like the other half of their Thoracle piece. Like either they've like just drawn it, or they've drawn it, or they are getting like the counter spell to protect it in hand, or whatever. Like that's a pretty easy one to like sniff out, pretty easy to suss out. Or like the Tymna player like just keeps playing dude after dude, like they're just getting swings. Like they're going to find the GA or the silence or the Grand Vulture. I just said GA. Ranger Captain. Like at some point to just squeak through their win. And it comes down to like flow of the table, I think, is the easiest way that I've been able to kind of figure that out. There's a certain way that every table is going to flow, you know. And I think that's been the easiest thing for me to latch onto when trying to improve my own threat assessment, because it's a lot of those like small things that you just kind of go unnoticed, or oh, I should have, you know, pinged the dork with my bowmasters or whatever. Okay, that removal spell that I used or counter spell that I used, like it was decent, but realistically I probably should have held it for something maybe better or more beneficial for the table.
Absolutely. And I think
And you can always talk to the table too.
Yeah, one of the most beneficial things you can do is it doesn't really work in tournaments. You want to do this like with the more casual games you're playing with your friends ahead of time, but just post-morteming different matches. You go through and you say, okay, well, like I think if I'd done this would have happened differently, or I could have tutored for this instead of that. Like get other people's takes and their opinions, and just talk really honestly and openly about the different options each player had. Like, oh, so at like on turn 3 or whatever, when you popped my Rhystic Study with your Pyroblast, why did you do that? It's like, oh, because I was scared of how many cards you're gonna draw. Like, yeah, then you could have talked to the table and told them like start paying their taxes if you're scared of that. Because we knew that Consult was in hand, and this person like cast a Wishclaw Talisman the turn before, so even if they hadn't gone for it yet, they were set up to. So it doesn't really make sense that you did that, because it's another Rhystic Studies at that point. It's another stack piece. I could draw an answer. You still had your answer. So like, and I wasn't like, I only had 2 cards in hand, so it's not like I was representing it big or whatever. I had 3 lands, the Rhystic Study, a Mana Dork, and 2 cards in hand. It was like, it's not super important for you to answer me, and then you say, oh yeah, I get that, but I also see that like you're playing like next turn you had your Mana Dork and your Tymna was ready to come down, and so you could start drawing more cards proactively. So I was really concerned about you just like hitting so far ahead in advantage, and then just having those kinds of discussions about how things could have gone, what people were representing, what people actually had, so you can sort of like figure out where other players come from in their mentality. It's very helpful for sort of like centering your own threat assessment.
How do you feel like you trying to go for the win like factors into the threat assessment conversation at all? Because you are, at least for me, whenever I go for the win, I know me and you think very differently on it. Like, I'm more likely to go for the Hail Mary play versus you, who will never go for the Hail Mary play, for example.
Not
like,
if I don't have to.
Yeah, not if you don't have to. Like, that is the last resort. Whereas I am looking for either like a decent window, or I have 2 or 3 really solid attempts like ready to go. That I think I can like fire off in one turn, or like sequence it in such a way that I can set myself up for like a 75-80% win on my next turn. I just need to put enough like pressure on the board that you don't know what you need to hit, or I have too many things to hit. And it's really, really hard to get over that.
Yeah, I think that a lot of players do tend to go for those like more Hail Mary, this might be a window, I'm gonna try and go for it, like attempts. And like you mentioned, that's not really the way I play the game. I'm a control player. I'm okay with games going longer. I'll just accumulate resources, and I'll just wait for what I know to be like my perfect window or whatever. So we talk about anime a lot, right? So you like yeah. So like Demon Slayer, they got that like that thread or whatever, like the opening thread or something, whatever they call it.
Don't they like sniff the thread or whatever?
Yeah, something like I don't know.
Yeah, it's something crazy like that.
You see that line, and you're like, all right, this is it, and I'm gonna get there as long as I follow this particular line. And that's sort of like, that's the way I play. It's like I'm just waiting until a thread presents itself, and as soon as I see it, bam, I'm going for it, because that's my window and I'm gonna get there. And of course, sometimes things are gonna get disrupted, like sometimes the thread breaks or whatever in the anime, and it's the same thing in real life. It's like you're playing Magic, and sometimes someone just had something that you didn't think about, and so
you put the table on 1% and they hit it.
Yeah, sometimes it's like I have exactly one answer and I have to rip it off this one Rhystic Study trigger, because after that I'm not getting any more. And sometimes they just flip it, and you're like, well, I'm blown out, and I guess I have to try for this either next turn or later in the game, and work on recovering. And that's sort of the way I play the game. So I look for the perfect window, and I full send it at that point, and because I know I'm gonna get there. And that's the way I approach it. And sometimes there is disruption, sometimes things don't go quite according to plan, and that's when that's when you have to decide, all right, this is the tricky part for me, is like threat assessing yourself. Like, at this point in time, am I the biggest threat to my own chances? If I keep sending this, what happens next? Looking ahead, it's like, if I keep sending this right now, I'm gonna be burning even more of my resources, and I might make it, or they might have the 2 more counter spells, and I might not make it. So should I stop here and then let them keep their interaction? I'll keep my interaction, I'll stop the next person, and then we'll just keep on this like dance that we do, or we just keep waiting and accumulating resources and looking for the right window and time to open. It's like that, sort of like that arcade game, right, where you like have to stop the light and something about lightning or something. I don't know. Anyways, but you have to like stop it on a specific point. So you just keep going back into that cycle where you're waiting for your chance to push the button and stop the light in front of you, or do I just keep forcing it? And if I keep forcing it, they
keep pressing the button.
Just keep jamming that button. Eventually, it'll stop there, and they will run out of resources. And at that point, I just need to have one more card than they do. I don't actually need to have like a good window, but I can just force it through. And that's where cards like Ranger Captain and Silence, Brand Abolisher, things like that. That's where those cards
make everything
are
easy.
Really good, is because you cast those cards and you force everything without having to commit anything. And you demand an answer immediately. And sometimes it's great to play those cards, like you mentioned earlier. It's like you just throw them out, and sometimes they sit there for turns and turns and turns, and they do nothing. You're nowhere close to a win. And then 6 turns later, it comes back to you, and you're like, well, this still hasn't been answered. I'm gonna go for it. And and you just run it, and you're gonna win the game. But sometimes over the course of those 6 turns, they catch a removal spell, or Silence eats a mental misstep, and you're like, well, all right, obviously someone had something. If they have something for this, I think they probably have something for the next thing. I'm just gonna go for like cast a mana dork or something then instead and pass the turn. And you can convert back to the back and forth, as opposed to trying to force a win.
No, and especially with like the forcing like angles, like trying to force the win, the keeping yourself in context is a very crucial thing. It's actually one of the first few like lessons I learned like really well in Rakdos, is like sometimes you just present very scary, and you have to keep that in mind. That like you can try and keep forcing it, but we talked about like step 1, step 2 like a while ago. If you keep forcing the issue and you just pass the turn on nothing, but you've burned the table of resources, well, the Thoracle player, that you just cleared the way for them. And that's always the fear with the Hail Mary play, like trying to force it through. It's like you can be strategic about it, and like, okay, I have like a piece of backup, or like I don't think the table like understands what needs to happen for me to win the game. You can play to that X factor a little bit of like, okay, I don't think the table understands like how critical like a 3-drop is for me, for example. 3 drops is just 3 CMC creature is just a magic number, or like my dockside count is X, and no one seems to be doing anything to like reduce the dockside count, but we're maintaining this X number. This is a perfect storm for me.
Yeah. I think you mentioned like having a big scary board and like presenting way scarier than you are. I think that is truly one of the biggest issues that I see with CDH players, aside from forcing wins, because God, that is my biggest peeve, is people just saying, well, I'm gonna send it, this is my time, and you're looking around the board going, this is not your time. Why do you this is not your time? Why do you think this? Please stop, please stop.
All of us
We're
play
losing to the
Dork
next person
Pass.
because you're not winning.
All of us play Dork Pass. What are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. So aside from that, the next biggest thing I see is small board, you're not close to winning. Big board, whether it's just like 5 mana dorks, like 4 or 5 lands, and then like my commander, oh, you're so far ahead, I have to end your career. I'm Toxic Deluging on 9 because you have a 5/5 and a bunch of dorks and like 2 cards in hand. You need to lose everything. And then the player casts that, and you're like, well, I have no counterspell to stop this, and if I do have a counterspell to stop this, then I lose my counterspell for the next person, and now I'm just out of the game. And so big board equals scary for inexperienced players. And then meanwhile, the person who's over here and done nothing other than hit a couple land drops and play their mana crypt on turn 1 for their Rhystic Study that's stuck around the entire game. And sure, people have been paying for taxes, but now my board's just been cleared, so I'm not paying for any taxes because otherwise I'll never get back.
Well,
into this
I gotta
game.
rebuild.
Yeah, I have to rebuild and getting back into this game, right? So now that person's drawing a bunch more cards, and also you didn't pay for your Toxic Deluge because you only had 3 mana, so they drew another card off that. And then I cast my counterspell, which was a Force of Will, and I was tapped out, so they drew another card off that. Now we're passing, and all the stacks pieces are gone. They just win the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, just, we mentioned Rhystic Study a lot. The One Ring's another great example, is like, this card draws 1 card for 4 mana. Obviously, not that scary. The next turn it drew 2 cards for 4 mana, which is a total of 3 cards for 4 mana. And it's like, that's still, like, not that scary. It's a casual card. And then the third turn, you're like, and then the third turn, you're like, I'm going to draw 3 cards, and you've seen 6 cards for 4 mana, and, like, that's a pretty good rate, especially when, like, you've only paid 3 life for it, right? But, conversely, like, they've paid 4 mana and 3 life to see 6 cards, and it's been 3 turns. So, like, those cards aren't actually helping them that much, because they saw them over such a wide spread, right? They have nothing else on their board, other than, like, their ignoble hierarchy. So, obviously, they are not the threat right now. It's the person over there. Excuse me. It's the person over there who just cast Thrasios for the 3rd time and is entirely, like, has an entire activation. Like, they have their Soul Ring and their Mana Crypt, 4 colorless mana, and they've recast Thrasios for 6.
And they're also on like 4. They're also on like 4 cards as well.
Yeah, like, they are the threat, right? So no. It's still the person with the One Ring, because they've seen so many cards and no one's been interacting with them because they haven't been doing anything. Mm-hmm. They're just setting up, getting ready for the perfect win. They don't need to commit to anything. They're in that spot where they're just waiting to see that thread, and as soon as they do, they're going to go for it, and you're not going to be able to do a damn thing about it because they've seen so many cards for 4 mana 5 turns ago, and they've just been hitting land drops.
Mm-hmm. The other card that has been sneaking up for me a lot of the time is just like jamming an Esper Sentinel, and then like someone goes for it, gets stopped, but like everyone's been interacting through everybody's turn. I've drawn like 10 cards over the course of 1 turn cycle.
Yep, Esper Sentinel is a super overlooked card.
It's so overlooked. It's so overlooked. I tend to pay for Esper Sentinels, I think, more than I tend to pay for Rhystic Studies, just because usually when Rhystic hits the board, I'm like, cool, Spheric Resistance. I'm just paying for everything until I can go for my win or land my GA or whatever.
See,
and at that point, it just doesn't matter.
And for me, that just strikes me as so silly, right? Like, why are you paying for this Esper Sentinel, but you're not paying for the Rhystic Study? The Rhystic Study triggers more than once a turn. If there's both in the field and they're controlled by different players,
I guess
you just let the Esper Sentinel draw the 1 card and do its thing. You pay for the Rhystic Study, because then when you cast your next spell, we know you're not paying for the Rhystic Study. But so many players, I see them like play it the same way you were just talking about it, right? They're like, oh, this Esper Sentinel, yeah, I'll pay for it. It's fine. I'm gonna keep you off your 1 card. I'll cast 4 spells and pay for none of them for Rhystic Study.
I guess it's like, contextual.
Okay.
I guess. Yeah, I guess it's contextual. Like, obviously, like if I'm looking to like deploy 4 spells, I'm going to be playing with Rhystic in mind, obviously. But it's just another. It's overlooked. I feel like the Esper Sentinel, at least in my experience.
It's very overlooked.
So many games, I just like, cool. I'll just jam out this Esper Sentinel, or I'll do this for this Esper Sentinel, just because I have just enough mana to cast it. But I like can't go for a win. Can't find like a setup piece. I can't like. I'm like. It's a worldly tutor that I'm casting. I can't go for like my Dockside or whatever, because that's not going to be good right now. Either my count's too high, or I don't have the resources to like do it, or there's like an oof coming down, or whatever reason. But like Esper Sentinel is just such a good neutral play.
And speaking of our favorite little card draw boy, the man that grabs him, Ranger Captain. It's another card.
What a sleeper card. That card is so fucking. Every time that card hits the battlefield, it's so insane.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's not really a sleeper. Everyone's playing it, but the thing that I think it's really important to keep in mind, Ranger Captain, is understanding which decks you need to remove Ranger Captain for, or like not let it hit the field, and which decks it's okay to let it stick around because it's actually a stacks piece, right? So like in my list, if I'm casting a Ranger Captain Abios, most of the time, I'm just letting it sit there for a couple of turns. And I'm going to crack it if someone else tries to win the game. Like, I'm investing 3 mana to silence you on your turn, which you're not going to go for the win because you see the captain, so it's just a fantastic stacks piece, right? And as long as it's there, no one's attempting their Stormwind. So if a deck like Mardu, or a deck like certain Jeskai lists might be a good example. Like depending on their board state, if they play this card, they're planning to crack it. They played it because they're trying to win, and they're going to be cracking it immediately. It is just a 3-mana summons. Or they're planning to crack it on their next turn when they have 4 mana instead of 3. Similarly with my deck, it also doesn't get dealt with a lot because you cast it, and it is just a stacks piece, right? But because I've never had to crack it because no one else has ever tried to win, now I get to my turn and I'm ready for it, and now I'm going to crack it and win the game because I never got burned. And so it's one of those things where sometimes cards like this land, and it's okay to let them land, it's okay to let them stick around, but it's a weird spot where you need to be ready to pressure like those individual elements in order to make sure that people are using them so they can't protect their own win, or you need to make sure that you have some sort of backup plan. Like maybe it's a creature spell, so endurance or off or something when it gets cracked to protect it. And it's just really hard to determine sometimes when you want to let those stick and when you need to like dedicate everything you have to stopping them from like hitting.
Yeah, and that's been the way I generally try to play the Ranger Captain. Is like I will toss it out there to prevent other people from winning. Like 60% of the time, 40% of the time, yeah, I'm trying to get to my turn with this bad boy. I want to keep it. Of course. Why would I want to keep an onboard silence for my win attempt? Clearly, I want to. No, and that's huge. I think it's so tricky too because you want to force out the Ranger Captain, but you don't want to like burn it. It's another resource that the table has that you can use. So sometimes like the Ranger Captain is scary, but like I think in those situations you have to look at how many cards have they seen, have they tutored recently, how much mana can they produce, are we currently under Dranth Magistrate, is the commander like crucial to the game plan for them. All of these things are going to help inform you of like, okay, is this a quote unquote value Ranger Captain? All Ranger Captains are value Ranger Captains. Or is this targeted? You know, is there a blue-red Storm player at the table? Is there a Jeskai player, a Grixis player? Where, yeah, sure, this Ranger Captain is scary if it gets back to me. However, so long as this card sits around, you can't win the game. And you're going to realistically try and pop off before I can because your window's starting to shrink. The stacks pieces are starting to come out. People are starting to accrue advantages, so your one Adnaz or whatever, I'll just use Adnaz as an example, it's going to be a lot harder to fight through because people just are going to be more and more prepared for you as those things go on and on. And trying to force out the Ranger Captain, again, you have to evaluate if it is good for the table or if you do need to get rid of it because someone's trying to set up. And I feel like you have a decent amount of context clues to like really keep you in. You know, you just got to take everything in stock, really. At least that's what I have to do. Hand size is something that I'm always asking the table for, and I generally try and stray away from asking individuals how many cards they have in hand because it's obvious, like what I'm trying to like suss out. So it's always like, okay, cards to the table, cards in hand, please. I need to know how many cards I'm up against right now. You know, that's usually been my like quick go-to metric for like, okay, how threatening do I feel like it is? But again, tutors and stuff like revealed information, play patterns, have you been leaving up mana, yada yada. All those things are super, super important to keep in like mind for threat evaluation.
Yeah. Sometimes, because like we were talking about, the biggest board is not always the biggest threat. Sometimes it's way more important, like the possible cards that an opponent could have in their hand. So when they're holding 14 cards, it's a lot easier for them to have the 4 that you're really, really concerned about, comparative to if something's on the field. Even if it's really bad for everybody, at least you can see it and you can answer it and you can find answers for it. I think that's one of the really interesting things about Winota is that the card is very honest and upfront about its game plan. Is I'm just trying to put stacks pieces in play and beat you to death. The deck is very good in that respect. It's also it also falls prey to the whole like my board is bigger, so I'm the threat deal. Unfortunately for Winota is that most of the time that's just correct. It's like if your board is big, you are the threat. If Winota's in play, or you are able to cast Winota on your turn, you are generally the biggest threat. Because we all know how hard it is to answer triggered abilities, and triggered abilities that just put stuff into play are very scary, very bad, hard to answer. And
especially if their first hit is Magus of the Moon.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Grand Abolisher or something.
Something nutty like that makes it really, really, like, even that much more challenging to deal with the deck, because you now can't, like, cast a removal spell, you can't interact any further on their turn, or your mana sources are all locked down, or their Thalia flips into play, and now you were ready, you had an answer, but now you can't answer it because your spell costs one more than you thought it was going to, and so it's like those types of deals. So for that, like, when you're dealing with Winota, and there are other decks too, like Tam, like look at the number of enablers that Winota has in play. If it is like 2 or 1, it might be fine if they get a swing or 2. If it's 3 or higher, basically you cannot let them get their triggers, or you're gonna lose the game. Whether or not it's that turn, it doesn't matter, because if they stick 2 of those 3 triggers, they're putting in the most relevant stacks pieces for the pod that they hit, and you're not making it back. It's just so incredibly hard. And their triggers dig so deep as well, and their deck is designed to do this every single turn, repeatedly. You have to make sure that all the enablers are dead every single turn, basically, or like just mitigate the risk as much as you possibly can. You all can also handle it, of course, by just never letting Winota see a combat step, which is also challenging because creatures are hard to deal with, especially when it's repeated every single turn and they just keep doing it, right? They just keep running it out there and going to combat, and you're like, man, I just really need to have something for this, and it's so hard. But like similarly, Tam, right? Like the deck is slower in the idea that like you have to have 3 mana to activate it and 3 counters. So you can track the amount of counters and the number of Tam activations that are available to them. But you also have to be careful, because while the deck is upfront about its game plan, it's a little tricksy because there are a lot of cards they can put into play that generate the mana or extra counters to make more activations, to go digging deeper, to go do it again, to go then, even if it's not like they do go from 3 mana and 3 counters in one turn sometimes, to like 3 activations. They've put 6 counters in play, and now they're out of mana, but they've also ended their chain with the most relevant stacks piece for the table on the battlefield. There's nothing you can do about it, because once again, it just puts it into play before it doesn't target, just does it. And now you're stuck with like trying to answer that stacks piece as well as their engine that can go through all of their stacks pieces. It's just a nightmare. And so decks like that, or like Karakushima, you have to make sure, you just have to make sure that you're answering their strategies before they can ever get online. And it's one of the things that we can be thankful that we play competitive for, because people don't really get as salty. Like, of course, people still like get tweaked or whatever.
Yeah, they
Sometimes
still
they
get
feel like
upset
they're
every
getting
now and again.
targeted. But sometimes, like certain decks, like Karakushima is a great example. Like, I don't care what the situation is, you just do not let them get Kark and Sakushima in play, because if you do, it's your odds of winning go from a coin flip to less than that by a lot, because they now have 2 triggers on every spell, and then the next spell is gonna be like a clone effect to get another Kark, and now they have 3 triggers to cast the spell 3 times, 4 times, then do it again. And it's like all of these things. A lot of times threat assessment is knowing what to answer before whatever the thing that is going to be the problem becomes an issue, right? Like Adnaz, you're never going to let Adnaz get onto the stack, or wait until it resolves to try and answer the Adnaz. That's just a terrible idea. You start by punching them with everyone's Timna attacks the Adnaz player if possible. If you have a random 4/4 to throw somewhere, you're throwing it at the Adnaz player, unless there's a reason to send it somewhere else. And so that idea of like answering threats before they become threats, that I think is realistically what threat assessment boils down to. At least efficient, correct threat assessment. It's like, this is what they can be doing. This is the thing that is the most threatening thing that can happen at the table right now. I'm going to do what I can do to answer that. And because of that, because we're trying to answer things before they occur, that's why, since a lot of stuff happens at sorcery speed, that's like game ending, that's one of the reasons that it can change so drastically with turn order, like we were talking about earlier, as to what the threat is. Like sometimes it's Tivit is landing next turn. This is a problem. I need a Drain of the Magistrate before Tivit lands, or I need a Collector Oof before Tivit lands, in order to make sure that that doesn't become a much bigger issue that I'm able to handle. Because something's a problem, now you're dedicating 1, 2, 3, 7 cards, a pool of resources to stopping them, which means when the next person tries to go off, you're down all these resources, and you don't have any resources to back your own win attempt. So
or put yourself ahead or something like that. Also, like, ideally, everyone's also in an ideal world, everyone's on the same game plan of, like, let's just say Tivit, for example, because it's a very telegraphed thing that's going to happen. Like, they're going to get 6 mana, they're going to cast the Tivit, and they're going to try and land the Tivit. So everyone starts counting the Tivit's mana, and I have this Vamp Tutor in my hand. I'm like, well, okay, I can get like my Oof, I can get my Drannith Magistrate, or I can get like a Pyroblast, for example. And that what you grab in that instance is going to be dependent. Like I'm not going to grab my Oof here because the Timna Kamal player, for example, is like they're already deploying stacks creatures. I can warn them ahead of time, like, hey, probably want to start thinking about getting Oof soon. Tivit's going to start landing, and we're just going to get screwed if they land a Time Sieve or whatever. I'm going to try and get like my Drannith Magistrate to lock them out, or I'm going to get my Pyroblast to either help fight the Tivit or help fight like potential counter spells to protect the Tivit, for example. You can diversify your way to prevent those things, those very telegraphed things. Adnos, for example, is another like great one that's like reasonably telegraphed despite it being an instant. Like 3 double black. We all know what that means, right? It's the same thing as like, okay, you have 3 mana open and you have black mana. That's opposition mana. Like that's opposition agent mana. Like you are representing opposition agent, or you have it and you're just holding it up for the right opportunity or whatever. You can see these little signs. There's a decent amount that is telegraphed that you can like seek out and find. Or Birthing Pod's a great one. Clear the 3 drops, clear the 2 drops. Get rid of all the creatures on that player's battlefield because they need the creatures to live.
Yeah.
Breach, for example. How many cards have they seen? What breach lines are they on? That's going to be dictated mainly by colors more so than anything else. Do we need to try and find an endurance? What happens if Thorkel comes out, like, right now? What happens if someone just puts a breach on the stack? I'm always asking myself, what's the worst thing this player can do, like, right now? And more specifically, what kind of worst thing? Because I feel like that's very much different. Deploying a critical stacks piece to lock someone out but guarantee their own win. Say they're really set up to win through, like, a rule of law effect, for example. Or they don't care about artifacts, so they can play an Oof to slow everybody else down, further their own game plan. Do I think the breach player is close to breaching at all? Do I smell Thorkel? Like, all these things that can just really get you out of nowhere if you're not prepared for them or expecting them.
Yeah, and you mentioned, like, tutor, if I have this Vamp Tutor for, like, a Drannith or an Oof or a Pyroblast, like, sometimes it's really important to like, look at how your actions to prevent the threat reactively can also proactively deal with that same threat later, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going back to Tivit, like, if they have 6 mana on their next turn with a land drop, so they're casting Tivit, but 3 of that mana is a Jeweled Lotus, like, if you cast a Drannith or an Oof, they're just going to wait until those get removed. Like, even if they may stick around for a really, really long time, eventually that player will find something to deal with those problems, and they'll, because those will be their greatest threats, and then they'll stick their Tivit, right? So sometimes it's more correct to say, all right, well, in response to your, like, I'll let you crack your Lotus, I'll let you tap your 3 mana, in response to you casting Tivit, does anyone have any spells they can cast? Yes? Okay, great. My Esper Sentinel trigger, I'll respond to it, I'll Vamp Tutor, I'll get a Pyroblast, and then you Pyroblast their Tivit. And now you've answered the Tivit, which is great, because you don't have to deal with it, and the next time they have to cast their Tivit, it's going to cost 8 mana. So now from their 3 lands, they have to go find 5 more mana, and there's no burst mana left, because that Lotus is gone, right? So it's just thinking about things like that, how they can push your advantage by just, like, even 1 or 2 mana pips into another turn sometimes makes a huge difference to a player's game.
Yeah, knowing when to kick that can down the road, it can buy you so much time. My favorite play is anytime I'm on a braid, I always love just abrading just Jewel Lotuses just out of nowhere. It's like, you're gonna use it now, you're gonna lose your hand, or it'll be in the graveyard and you have to cast the breach.
Jewel Lotus, like LED.
I'm sorry, LED. My bad. Yeah, LED. Like, just force the activation or just get rid of it. Just using those resources. So many people just like run out like a random LED just because don't want to get taxed or don't want to like trigger a Ristic or whatever. Which, like, fair enough. But also, you left a crucial combo piece hanging. That's 3 more mana. That's 1 more breach activation. That's going to narrow your margins significantly. This Nature's Claim isn't really doing much. I don't necessarily need to answer, like, the Rhystic Study, for example. There's no Birthing Pod players in this pod. There's no, like, Pivots. There's no Time Seize. Like, this Nature's Claim is probably going to be as good as it can, like, right now, unless something crazy happens that you, like, randomly really need the Nature's Claim for. I was going to say, to answer the One Ring, that card has
Doesn't answer the One Ring.
Doesn't answer the One Ring. Just run Deglamour.
Deglamour.
Yeah, Deglamour. I don't have much in terms of, like, anti-One Ring tech. I think my tech is just, I'm gonna just kill you before it matters, or try to.
Bounce spells are pretty good.
Bounce spells
So
are
I
pretty
hear.
good. So I hear, yeah. No, they're pretty aight. They're pretty aight. A Touch the Spirit Realm answers it.
Counter
At least
spells are also pretty good against the One Ring.
Those are also very good. Those are also very, very good. What would you say? I guess this is a hard question to ask because it's so contextual based on the game. But like outside of like the obvious win cards like Adnan's Breach Thorkel, like what are the cards that you're always like fearing? You know, like coming down. For me, it's always like the big fuck off like value engine cards like Kong Sphinx.
Con Sphinx?
Yeah.
Con Sphinx is a card that people are like always super wary of if it ever goes on the stack. I think cards like that are a little bit more, tend to be a little more niche, where it's like you're never plotting around them specifically. But as soon as they go on the stack, like alarm bells just start ringing, and everyone's like, "All right, guys, let's come together as a table to answer this, so we don't lose the game." Because all this card does is draw them 6 cards every turn at minimum, and then we lose the game.
Niv Mizzet is also one that I try and prepare for that card as much as possible. I'm never prepared for that
Niv
card.
Mizzet's a really good card. I think like certain cards that just send up alarm bells for me. I think Thrasios is a big one.
Really?
Timna. Just because they just draw so many cards and nobody answers them except for me. I'm like, guys, let's counter this Thrasios. Guys, let's kill this Timna. And everyone's just like, it's fine. It'll be okay. They're just going to recast it if we don't XYZ. And it's like, yeah. But then they're doing that instead of trying to win the game or draw more cards, which is so good. Like, those cards send up big alarm bells. Crom doesn't really... It is a very, very good card. It's for the same reason as Esper Sentinel. But they've also invested 5 mana into it. So it's like... It's not really... It doesn't send off alarm bells when someone casts it, usually.
So Crom's Facility is such a big investment.
Yeah.
That it's like, they put all their eggs into that basket. You just deal with it.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, Grand Demolisher is a big one, because unlike
Yeah.
Ranger Captain, you can't use it to help a table. You can only use it to, like, try and protect your win. So I think for me, it's like, it tends to be cards that are selfish. Where, like, Grand Demolisher, Consecrated Sphinx, what's another good one? Something like Elishnorn. Elishnorn's, like, tricky because sometimes, like, it does stop it stops all the ETBs, which is great, but also like it pushes your own advantage so far off double ETBs. It's like, guys, we're losing if this sticks. Exactly, double dockside.
My double E-wit.
I'm
gonna get this advantage piece and the protection spell I used earlier. Ooh.
I think anytime someone casts an Eldritch Evolution Neoform, I'm like kind of like, you can generally infer based upon context what a person is going for. Eldritch Evolution is so flexible that it really can get anything. It's just such a wide variety of cards to the field. That one sets alarms ringing in my head all the time. I think, is there anything else that just like scares me to go on the stack that's not super obvious? I think if I had to pick one more, obviously Overloaded Rift, where it's like just a one-sided board wipe is just monstrously good. Yeah, I think those are probably the main ones. You can get into some like more niche cards that like push specific strategies like for that individual deck really hard, and those are kind of always an issue. We've been talking about a lot about Winota this episode, so like the Goblin Warlords that like make tokens every turn that have haste. Those are like
they
really
land
problematic
or whatever.
Need to be dealt with right away, in my opinion. But yeah, for TAM it's like Wall of Roots. It's like the TAM casts a Wall of Roots that's like, bing, 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 bing. Guys, we need to kill this. Guys, we need to kill this. Guys, we're gonna lose the game. Guys, we need to kill this. Yeah, I think that's most of the ones that just like set my heart on fire. Tavish Thought. That's another big one. Tavish Thought.
Yeah. That every time the card lands, I feel like my win percentage just drops immediately
It's
whenever that
so
card
it
lands.
draws so many cards and it protects itself so well.
Yeah. I think the big thing that I'm always afraid of, outside of like the big like mid-range beaters, like these like this is a giant card that will draw me a lot of cards. It's also protected and has evasion. Yep, very scary. But any evolution effect is because like you said, it literally puts anything into the battlefield. It's the reason why we fear Winota, because you don't know what they're going to get. You can try and suss it out, but you don't have to answer it.
Yeah.
Like this Eldritch Evolution going to 4 will grab everything.
It goes 4 or less.
Everything.
4
Yeah,
or
it's
less.
4
That's what
or
people
less.
forget. Like Neoforms,
Yeah.
it's like Neoform, Birthing Pod, Vivian, even like these cards go up. You can generally guess what the player's going to get in like 99.9% of contexts. However, Eldritch is like, okay, I've sacked a 3 cost. That means I can get any 5 cost, or 0 cost, or 1 cost, etc., etc., etc. It's like
anything in between,
well,
maybe.
great. Now I have to think about what could you be playing that's so good here. Sometimes the answer is really obvious. Like they sacked their 2 cost, they're just getting a Dockside Distortions. Sometimes the answer is not so obvious. They're like, well, I sacked my 3 cost, and now I'm gonna go put this like this 1 cost card that combos into play or something like that. And you're going, well, I just didn't see this coming. Like, how am I supposed to answer this now? Like, I'm gonna sack my 3 cost and put my Sylvan Safekeeper in play. Now I'm gonna go cast my creature-based combo from my hand, and there's nothing you can do about it if you don't have the counterspell. It's like, well, great. I didn't know what was in your hand, and I had no idea the Sylvan Safekeeper was coming, so how was I supposed to prep for it?
Yeah, like Eldritch Evolution, Finale of Devastation, especially if like I'm a big fan of just like pumping your finale by 1, just delaying it just a little bit, just so you can increase the X value, just to keep options open. Is scary. Anytime I see Corticall on the stack, my heart just drops because I'm like, oh cool, anything, add instant speed. Great.
Yeah, Finale and
excellent.
Core, just like X tutors that go get whatever you want. It's like Tooth and Nail, right? Back when that card was really big, it's the same thing. It's like, well, great, we probably know what we're losing to, but also it can just be literally anything.
Yeah, it could be 2 just giant dorks off of the Tooth and Nail, but like maybe that's what they needed. They just had everything in hand, you know? But they just need the gas to push through. With like a lot of the synergy-based commanders, like think not exactly Krakashima, but like along those similar lines, where like it's not like a draw engine in the command zone, it's like an enabler of some kind. Those are always like the harder decks for me to like figure out like where we need to interact, how we need to interact, what's the game plan. Just because if it's like an unknown like brew or whatever, like it's just the X factor is something that I'm always fearful.
Yeah, I'm always scared of things that I don't understand, for sure.
Love that human nature,
right? Yeah. But I do think that it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of these decks, if you don't understand them, you shouldn't be letting them get off the ground, because if you don't understand how they're going to work, your chances of missing a critical point of interaction and then it just goes by and it's gone is very high. And so it sounds weird where it's like, I don't understand this, so I'm going to hammer them into the ground, but also that might be wrong. But also, like, then you look at it from a different way. It's like, you don't understand how it works. You don't know how to stop them once they've started assembling their engines and whatnot. You should just be hammering them into the ground, so that they cannot get to a point where you can't interact, right? So like there's like this give and take, because if you do that, then they're also like not going to be able or want to help you when you need assistance. So it's like this weird spot. And at that, when it comes to that, it's like for a lot of it, it's really just on players that they need to go out and build that knowledge base of how things work, so they know how to stop various strategies, when and where to interact, so that you can avoid putting yourself in a position where you beat on somebody too hard and now they don't want to or cannot help you, but you also want to avoid giving them like the ability to just run away by developing whatever their like homebrew strategy is, right? So it's just really gotta be really careful. It's a delicate balancing act.
Definitely. And for a lot of those like unknown decks, I mainly rely on just like, okay, what do I know like this color can do at the very like bare minimum? Like, okay, some off the wall Grixis brew, it seems pretty likely we're going to be doing like Breach Thorkel stuff versus like
I don't know what's a commander that plays a lot of like giant weirdo cards, like Magda, I guess.
Magda
But
plays a
even then-
ton of giant weirdo cards.
That is, yeah, that's like the deck. You get to play a lot of giant weirdo
I
cards.
think
but even still,
Saval is
like,
another good example.
yep, Sabal is a great one. Any commander that lets you toolbox a decent amount. So like Sisay, both Sisays, Isan, like those kind of cards that are like your whole deck in a can, kind of. Even still, like just read the cards and just kind of be like, just like think like, okay, why would you bring this to a tournament? Like, what is this doing? What does this enable? What kind of effects? I got a little bit with red, green, Minsk, and Boo, because I was like, I don't really know what this deck plays, and then
That deck is so cool.
it's a cool deck. It's a super cool deck. But like, Pump Spell came out of nowhere. I'm like, well, oh right, yeah. Of course it would play Pump Spells because they're just draw spells for in the command zone. Of course, like this Giant Growth is just Ancestral Recall. Like why? Duh, obviously.
Yeah.
But it sometimes you just gotta get popped by it. By the mutagenic growth on a Birds of Paradise to be like, oh, that's okay. That makes sense. That's the kind of cards that we're casting here. And you just kind of have to hope that depending on the deck, you're gonna be able to give yourself enough like wiggle room to be like, you can take the hit and then go, okay, I understand what's happening, and then just sock them right back.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Well, I've evaluated enough.
I think we have determined the most important threat on the field.
It is the Kenrith. It's always the Kenrith, ladies
No,
and gentlemen.
please.
Every single time it's the Kenrith. All right. Yeah, just kill him. Just kill him right there. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for coming back to Man on the Rocks, Atlas. Always a pleasure, my friend.
It's been a great time as usual.
Absolutely. We'll catch you next time.